Dave Talks Comics, Episode 73, Appleseed Comic Con 2015, Part 2. Welcome to Dave Talks Comics, a program on the subjects of comic books and cartoons. I talk about comic books I have read and cartoons I have watched. I talk from my notes. I don't go panel by panel or scene by scene. I try to do more than just summarize the stories. This program is not spoiler-free. I try not to spoil everything, but in the process of talking about these comic books and cartoons, I will probably spoil them in some way. On this episode, I will be talking about the first day of Appleseed Comic Con 2015, which was on May 16th, 2015 in Fort Wayne, Indiana. So I'm back from day one of Appleseed Comic Con. I had a good time, just like I did last year. And I've got some notes. I went to both panels like I said I was going to, and I'll get into that in a minute. And yeah, so I guess I may as well just get into this and talk about the people I saw, the books I bought. I didn't buy a whole lot of books. I'm going to try and buy a few more tomorrow. And the art I got, and the panels I went to. Yeah, I think that's more or less the sum of what I'm going to talk about here. So I got there just after 10 o'clock when they opened, and the place wasn't busy at all at that point. Most of the vendors, I'd say, were set up, but there were still probably maybe 15% of them, I don't know, I'm just guessing off the top of my head, who either weren't there or weren't fully set up and were in the process of getting set up or that sort of thing. So I walked around for a while. The first panel that I wanted to go to wasn't until noon, so I had about almost 2 hours to walk around. So I kind of took my time and worked my way down one aisle, looking at various things. The first person that I can recall that I stopped to talk to was Travis Horseman. And he's a writer. He wrote a book that I supported through Kickstarter, and I got the first volume of. I haven't talked about it on the podcast. It's called Amiculus, and it's the first book of 3. And it's the second book actually is they're launching the Kickstarter campaign at the beginning of June, and they'll probably have a reward level in there where you can get both the first and the second book for. Well, I'm not sure what the price will be, but there probably will be a reward level where you can get both the first 2 books. I'm not sure if it's available through Amazon or through other retailers. I want to say it's available electronically, but I'm not sure about that. Anyway, Amiculus is a story about the fall of Rome, and it is kind of a story within a story, because what you have is the story begins 75 years after the fall of Rome. I think it's 75 years. I know it's at least a few decades after the fall of Rome, which happened in 476 AD. And a senator, maybe? No, I don't think it's a senator. But somebody who's been tasked with looking into what happened to the Roman Empire is coming from the east, from the Eastern Roman Empire, which I think is also known as the Byzantine Empire, I think. And he is tasked with finding out what happened to Rome, and so he travels to Rome to find out what happened there. And so then the story, then you get into what happened, and it's basically based on what he finds in Rome, and he finds this library with these monks who have these books. And it's a pretty good story. I really I enjoyed it. It's tough to make a decision on the whole thing since I've only read the first third of it. The second and third parts have not been published yet. They're still in the process, I guess, of being put together, probably being drawn, although he did say the whole thing has been written at this point. So I talked to him, to Travis Horseman. Then I wandered around some more. The next person I can remember talking to is Ron Braun. He did a book called, he's done a number of comics, some of them web comics. One that I bought from him last year at Appleseed Comic Con was called Hello Cruel World. And I think I just read it recently. I bought it last year, but I only got around to reading it recently. And it's a good book. It's a web comic. It kind of mixes horror and kind of slice of life drama, and then he's also got this story about this platypus from another planet, and but it was fun and I enjoyed it. And so we talked for a little while, maybe 5 or 10 minutes. I'm not sure. Then I moved on. I also talked to John and Timothy O'Brien, who I've met a few times before, including at Appleseed Con last year. I've also seen them at Heroes Con. They are from North Carolina, although I don't think they live anywhere near Charlotte. I think they're out towards the coast somewhere. So I talked to them about, conventions and how things are going and stuff like that, what I was interested in, what we've seen, comic stuff in general. The next person I talked to, I believe, was Bruce Warden, who is doing a comic book on a zombie outbreak at Woodstock. And he's doing it, each book is going to be focused on a particular act that played at Woodstock, and I believe he's doing it in chronological order. So far he has 5 books out, 5 issues out, and he says it's going to be 32 issues in all. He's trying to do, I think he said, 2 issues per year. I guess that means he has a day job, and this is just something he does on the side. So I'm not sure. So we talked about his book a little bit, and he gave me some of the details. He said they've introduced some of the main characters, but there's going to be a couple more introduced. He's going to try and break it down. It sounds like it is going to be collected eventually, but it's going to be 8 issues per collection, something along those lines. And I think the first collection is going to be the first day of Woodstock, and the second and third collection are going to be the second day of Woodstock, which apparently had considerably more acts, and then the fourth collection would be the third day of Woodstock. I walked around some more. I stopped at Andy Jewett's table and chatted with him a little bit. I afterwards moved on to Dave Wachter's table, who was right next to him. Now, Dave Wachter, I had commissioned him to do a Enemy Ace piece for me, which he did a beautiful job on, which includes the Enemy Ace's Fokker triplane. And it's kind of got a, well, I'm going to put it up, but to describe it, it's kind of got a, you see the triplane kind of going down in a dive. He's been hit, but it doesn't look like it's unclear whether he's going to crash or not, but you can certainly see he's got the machine guns blazing, and you can see the propeller whirling. He did a great job with that effect. In fact, the whole sense of motion in the picture I really love. And then you have an inset of the Enemy Ace's head, because in the picture you can see Enemy Ace in the plane, but it's not, you can only his head is very small in there. And I had asked him to try and work the plane into the commission. I didn't. I paid him for a full body commission, which in a lot of cases means a head to toe commission. But I wanted the plane, so I understood that there's no way you can work a full body commission and the plane in. It would be almost like having 2 characters if we were going to have a full. And plus, it would be very. how would you do that exactly? And this way makes more sense. He told me he took it from, although I have not looked this up, he told me that he took it from a cover of Enemy Ace, or maybe it was from Star Spangled War Stories. Probably from Star Spangled War Stories, because that's where Enemy Ace appeared back in the 60s. And he took the idea for this cover, or for this commission from that. And I guess used what I had asked him to do as well. So that took me up to about 1:00, noon. So that was about 2 hours that I spent. And at that point, unlike last year, I had not looked at any comic books. What I mean is not looked through any comic book boxes. I had not done any bin diving, looking for back issues, looking for trades, etc. So then I went to the Jack Kirby panel. Now this panel was awesome. It was, off the hook. It was, the full title of the panel is Anti-Life Equations, Persistent Themes in the Comics of Jack Kirby. And the person who presented it was Kyle Latino, which is a name that I know from, I want to say, the 11 o'clock comics message boards. But I'd never met him before, and if I'd seen him before at one of these conventions, I didn't know him by sight. The panel was basically what the title sounds like, Persistent Themes in the Comics of Jack Kirby. In other words, it was not a retrospective panel. He did not go through chronologically through Kirby's work from the 40s, or maybe he started in the 30s. I'm not sure exactly when his work began. It probably was the 30s, the late 30s, the 30s through the 90s. He didn't do it that way. Although actually I'm not sure if he was I believe he died in the 90s, but I don't know if he was still doing any work in the 90s. He certainly worked into the 80s. So he showed us, he first started off by talking about Jack Kirby's early life and talked about how his early life affected his work. He showed us pictures of the Williamsburg Bridge and talked about, because Kirby had grown up near the Williamsburg Bridge, how that may have impacted him, and talked about how you could see in his early artwork before he was, I'm not sure if he enlisted or was drafted in the Army, but before he went overseas to fight in World War II, and unlike a lot of comic book artists, Jack Kirby did do that. He talks about, Kyle talked about how Kirby would include all these little details. If you look at his artwork, it isn't just a city street. You see everything run down. You see garbage piled up. You see the buildings are run down. You see kids wearing clothes that don't fit. Kids from poor neighborhoods wearing clothes that don't fit. Things that really which spoke to him. And once again, these are the themes. These are the things from his life that are then reflected in his artwork. He also talked about the humor from that time. He talked about, and the example he presented to us was the Thing and the Human Torch, and about how they would get into fights. But it wasn't really fights. It was this was how they kind of would spar with one another. This is how they would kind of deal with one another. And he talked about Armageddon, which is on Apocalypse, I believe, and how that was a reflection, once again, also of his life. And that was something from much later in his career. So he talked about how Kirby's early life impacted his work in the 40s, his work in the 60s, in the Fantastic Four, with those interactions between the Thing and the Human Torch, and then again in the 70s in his Fourth World stuff, in his Armageddon, in the presentation of the ghetto on Apocalypse in the Fourth World books. He also talked about how Kirby desperately wanted to escape the Lower East Side, and he did what he could to do so, and to make sure that he wouldn't have to return. And that's why he worked so hard throughout his career. That's why that's why he was, one of the hardest working creators probably ever in the history of comic books. And why he was constantly putting out so much material, because he didn't want to return to the life that he had known when he was a kid. And he also mentioned Street Code, Kyle mentioned Street Code, which I had never heard of before, but apparently it's a highly autobiographical work that Kirby did. So it's something I really want to look into, because I don't know anything about this. He did show us a couple panels from it, but that was about it. He talked about, then he started getting into the war stuff. That was kind of the second part of his presentation. The second influence, the second theme that influenced Jack Kirby. And he talked about how Hitler, even before Kirby went into the army and fought in World War II, how he, as a Jew, he saw, growing up in New York, he saw Hitler as the greatest bully that ever lived. And he showed us the cover, that classic cover of Captain America. I think it might have even been the first issue of Captain America, where Captain America is punching Hitler. And as I said, that's what he saw Kirby as. He saw Hitler as a bully, and that was at that point. Now, he also talked about boy commandos. He showed us some covers from Boy Commandos. He then showed us some covers from Foxhole, which was a comic book that he did in the 1950s, a war comic he did in the 1950s. And he showed us how things changed, how everything got much more gruesome and much more graphic in Foxhole than it had been in Boy Commandos. But the other thing he emphasized in Boy Commandos was that something like 9 months before the D-Day landing in Normandy in June of 1944, Kirby was basically showing that exact same thing in the Boy Commandos, on the cover of the Boy Commandos, in a story. He then went on to talk about Sergeant Fury and the Howling Commandos, and then finally he also in Tales of Suspense and the Losers, and he showed how Kirby's approach to violence, or approach to the war, and how a particular instant, a particular occurrence showed up both in his art from the 40s. Was it the 40s? No, well, from the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, a scene where people were getting gunned down, where people were getting executed by Nazi soldiers, how it showed up and how it evolved over that time. It went from being where you don't see it at all to where you see it very viscerally and very clearly that this is what's happening. And and the later stuff, what's interesting about that to me is that, as Kyle pointed out, the later stuff was approved by the Comics Code Authority, even though it was more viscerally violent than the earlier stuff. He also talked about the preponderance of sound effects in The Losers, and which was a war comic that he did at DC, and how, which to me, from watching a lot of war films, is about the jarring, if you watch something like Saving Private Ryan, or if you watch a series like The Pacific, or a series like what's the other one by the same team that I can't remember, about the unit from the 80s. Is it the 82nd Airborne, or is it the 101st? I think it's the 82nd Airborne. Band of Brothers. That's it. If you watch that, you see how loud it could be, and to my mind, what Kirby was doing was trying to bring to life what it was actually like to be in the middle of a battle where you had bombs and artillery shells being dropped all around you, and gunfire and confusion. That's what I took from it, even though Kyle didn't specifically say that. I've mentioned the repetitions of the Death Squad scene. He also talked about Captain America in Tales of Suspense, how this was supposed to be a kid's comic, and yet what was he showing? Captain America was one of the first stories that Captain America had, he was talking about his teenage sidekick Bucky, who he lost in World War II, who was killed in World War II, and so once again, it was constantly coming back. How the war was constantly being reflected in his artwork and in his storytelling. The third and final section of this presentation was on creative exploitation. And here, what Kyle was trying to get at was how Kirby was frustrated over not getting not being compensated properly, not being acknowledged properly for the work he was doing. He talked about how Kirby wanted to destroy everything in Thor, how the Norse gods went through this cycle where everything would be destroyed in Ragnarok. And he talked about how in issue 128 of Thor he wanted to kill all of the gods. And of course he couldn't do that because this was, these are comic book characters and they want to keep putting out these comic books. But how he ultimately ended up being able to do that when he went to DC and he did the New Gods. And Kyle showed how you could take pages from Thor, and it wasn't issue 128, I think it was issue 147, yes, Thor 147. And some of the first issues of the New Gods, of that whole New Gods story, and you could put them up right, and he did this on the screen, and showed us how it's almost exactly the same. The panel layout is the same. Basically what's happening is the same. And that was a very interesting side-by-side comparison that he did. And he also showed us what Kirby's notes were on the page as compared to Stan Lee's dialogue on the page. And how I think there he was trying to make the case for the fact that Kirby was doing a lot more than just drawing the comic. He was also writing, setting the scene, and so he wasn't just drawing the pictures, but he was also describing in the words what was going through the minds of the characters, what they were experiencing, what they were seeing. Then he got into talking a little bit about Funky Flashman, who is a character who is supposed to be a parody kind of Stan Lee. He talked about Glorious Godfrey. Now, this is all New God stuff. He talked about Glorious Godfrey and how he is kind of a parody of Billy Graham. He talked about comparisons between Billy Graham and Hitler. The comparison that Kyle made, is that they were both people who were trying to control others. And that this is once again a reflection of Kirby's frustration that he wasn't able to control what he was creating. That these were things that belonged to other people. He talked about Dr. Bedlam and Granny Goodness. And then he talked about Darkseid, and how Darkseid was really Kirby's nemesis. Darkseid was the force of evil. And then he finally got to the anti-life equation, which was the title of the panel. And what the anti-life equation was, what Kyle described it as, is that it's the proof that Darkseid has the power to destroy everything. And it's not that he needs it to destroy everything, it's that he needs it to confirm that he can destroy everything. And this led him to talk about how what Kirby believed was that even an enemy that is supremely powerful can be defeated, because the way that enemy wins is when people do not fight back. And what I wrote down here is that the bad guys only win if we give in. Or he also said that line that all it takes for for evil to win is for good men to do nothing. I think that's what it is, or something along those lines. And from that comes the idea that what Kyle saw in Kirby's work is that you win by escaping. You win by by getting creative freedom, and to do that you need to move on sometimes. And that's what he did when he moved from Marvel to DC and then back to Marvel, and his work into independent work later on, although Kyle didn't exactly say all of those things. Anyway, I taped this panel. I think it was an excellent panel. He kept talking at a very good clip. I think I got a very good recording of it. I was sitting in the front row. He was using a microphone. I believe this panel I believe somebody's going to be putting it up online. I believe it was also digitally recorded. I mean, video recordings were made of it. So, although I'm not sure how clear the pictures on the screen will be in that. So, after that, there was another panel in that room, but I didn't stick around for that. Instead, I went back to the show. I went back to the convention floor, and I walked around some more. I went to the Sweet So Geek table, which I went to last year, but I didn't buy anything from them. And they are a company that makes chocolates and other treats. I think most of them are chocolates, but other treats that are kind of, sci-fi and superhero themed stuff, and other geeky things like Harry Potter and stuff like that. And I had stopped there earlier, actually, and looked at their table, but I couldn't decide what to get. So this time I went back and actually bought a couple things. I bought a Stark Cravings, which is a Tony Stark or Iron Man themed piece of chocolate, which is shaped like Iron Man's mask and is made with butterscotch armored in milk chocolate. And I also bought a Han Rolo, which is a carbonite Han Solo, carbonite freezing Han Solo, from Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. It's him, milk chocolate carbonite filled with caramel goodness. Now, I've eaten the Stark Cravings, and I got to tell you, it was very good, but it's also very sweet. I'm tempted to go back tomorrow and ask him about the chocolate, where he got the chocolate, because the chocolate tastes much better, to me at least, than the chocolate that you get from like Hershey's. I'm not sure if it's better than some of the really good European chocolates you can get, like Toblerone, but it's very good, and so I'm curious about, because in the list of ingredients on the package, it just says milk chocolate. It doesn't say anything about if they made the milk chocolate or who made the milk chocolate. And they do have a website. You can order stuff from them. But I figured it probably was best to buy the stuff while I was there. And I only paid $6 for those two chocolates. And that Han Rolo was big too. I mean, in fact, I didn't even eat all of the Han Rolo. I took a couple bites out of it and then I put it away in the fridge for now, because after having that Stark Cravings, which was a little smaller, I think, than the Han Rolo, I did not need to eat all of the Han Rolo. So let's see, what else did I do? I went to see Courtney Hahn, who does a webcomic with another. I think she's about to. She does a webcomic. She's fairly young, but she does a webcomic called Podunk, an old-fashioned cowboy comedy, and it can be found at podunkcomic.tumblr.com. I checked it out. They don't update it, or they haven't updated it extremely regularly. I think it goes back a couple years. But I really liked what I saw there. I really liked I flipped through it, jumping page to page, and I thought they did a really good job with the art and with the sequentials and with, because there are, I'll be honest, there are some web comics where you look at them and it seems like just a couple of heads standing there, and it seems like most of the focus that the creators have given, whether it's one person or two, and in this case she is one of a team. There was a writer there who I also spoke to briefly. I think she might be the one who was in the program guide, is sitting next to Courtney, which would be, let's see, which would be Elise Walters, I think. I'm not certain on that. So their webcomic is very good. Like I was saying, I think a lot of webcomics, they tends to be, sometimes there's too much focus on the dialogue and there's not enough on the cartooning, and I think they do a very good of keeping the cartooning interesting and showing, there's always motion, there's always facial expressions, and they're always changing, and so you get that flow going. And that's from what I saw in the webcomic. So I got her, she was doing commissions for $5. Nothing huge, just like a 3x5? No, 4x6. Yeah, probably 4x6. Commission of Odin for me, which is very nice. And although his armor looks a little more like what Thor would be wearing than Odin, so but he's got the spear and he's got the eye patch and he's got the beard, which I guess some versions of Thor do have, but not the version from the movie, which is what I referenced when I talked about getting a commission to her. Let's see, who else did I talked a little more to John and Timothy O'Brien. And I talked to Tim Barron. Tim Barron has done a couple comics. I think I'm going to go back tomorrow and maybe buy one or two of them. I spoke to him last year a little bit about stuff. Quite often it's funny because you get talking to people and they're there to sell a book or because they've done a comic book and they're trying to, distribute it and get a following, I guess, Although, yeah, I guess. But it's funny because quite often you'll start talking to somebody and you'll end up in a conversation with them about something that has nothing to do with their webcomic, Now, there are some people who don't know how to talk about anything but their comic. I don't know. They seem to start by talking about their comic. I guess that's the way to go. Especially if you don't know somebody too well, although you could start by talking about the convention. And my feeling is the best approach is not to sell too hard on your wares. That's my feeling. If you seem too desperate, unless you've got something that's really great, and not everybody does, sad to say, not everybody does. It's often not great to push too hard on what you're selling. That's just my impression. I don't know. So after I talked to Tim, I headed down to the second panel, which was the Jaime Hernandez panel. And Jaime Hernandez is one of Jaime and his brother Gilberto do a book called Love and Rockets. They've been doing it for over 30 years. I only just recently, earlier this year, started reading Love and Rockets. I bought the first collection, which is called Maggie the Mechanic, and it's of Jaime's earliest work on Love and Rockets. I actually bought it 2.5 years ago at SPX, and then it sat on my shelf until earlier this year when I realized if I was going to go to Appleseed Con, then I should really read the book. So I've got some point of reference, so I know what his work is like, So I went to the the panel, which was good. It didn't have quite the same kind of energy level as the Jack Kirby panel did. It was moderated by, it was basically Jaime, and he had basically an interviewer there who was Wendy Freeman, who does the Double Page comic book podcast. And she asked a lot of questions, although she did throw it open to the audience for questions on a few occasions. The main characters in Jaime's stories in Love and Rockets, and I guess I should say a little bit about the difference. Jaime and his brother Gilbert both work on Love and Rockets, but they each have their own separate stories. And Maggie and Hopi are the main characters in Jaime's stories of Love and Rockets, although not every story is about them. Sometimes there's stories about some of the supporting cast members. So Wendy asked him about various stuff about Love and Rockets, like about his clean style of drawing. She compared it to Dan DeCarlo. She asked him about the characters' ages and how they impact the story, because the story it's not just about Maggie and Hopi in a particular time of their life. It's followed them over, from what I understand, because I've only read the early stories at this point, over at least about 20 to 25 years of their life. He talked a little bit about gravity, and he talked about the characters' ages, because she asked him, how do you write the stories, and how do you write the characters so well? And he was a bit effusive about that, but he did say that he felt that the characters' ages helped him to define the stories and to decide where the characters should be and what they would be doing at this point or that point in their lives. He also talked about gravity, and by gravity means, I think he meant literally the force of gravity and how it affects how people look and how it helps to guide him, I guess. And I may be putting words into his mouth here, or maybe this is a better way to put it might be, this is how I interpret what he said, that gravity helps him he's got a good eye for it and for how it, how a person stands, he said, how a person's face, the skin on your face starts to drop over the years, and how you would draw a person differently because of that, if you're going to be realistic. And also he mentioned how it's something that he sees as lacking in some artists. He didn't name any names, but he sees as lacking that some artists, they're very good technically at some things, but they don't seem to have taken into account the force of gravity. They talked a little bit about Fantagraphics, and which is where Love and Rockets is published today. If you're interested in buying it, is their publisher these days. They also talked about the groundswell of the mid-1980s when you had books like Watchmen and Dark Knight, and they didn't say it, but Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles would be another one that revolutionized things at that point, and how there was, things were changing in the comic book industry at that point, and how Love and Rockets was a part of that, although it wasn't like they were all walking in lockstep together. It's just that they were all part of these comic books that were influential and were changing things and helping to change things. Wendy asked him about the punk scene of the late 70s and I guess early 80s, and Jaime talked about how this was his discovery phase, and he talked about going to shows with his brothers, and how the music kind of opened things up for them and gave them the feeling that they could experiment and that things, I guess, didn't have to be rigid. I don't think he said that, but I think that's what I got from what he said. She asked him about his brothers, and he's got 4 brothers. He's the 4th brother. They've also got 1 sister, and he talked about how comics were always around, and he mentioned that their mother encouraged them to read comic books, and that she had read comic books. He talked about doing some work for booze labels. And then I got a chance to ask a question, and I asked him about which comic books his mother read, and was there any overlap between the comic books his mother read and the comic books he and his brothers read. And I had 2 reasons for asking. Number one, I was just curious, but I guess the reason why I was curious is because my mother read comic books when she was younger, although there's little, if any, overlap between what she enjoyed reading and what I enjoy reading. And she never encouraged me to buy things. What I found out is that his mother encouraged his oldest brother to buy things that she was interested in. She had been reading, he mentioned, Captain Marvel and the Blackhawks and the Spirit. And so when she saw Kitchen Sink Press, I think it would have been in the 1970s, reprinting the Spirit, she encouraged him to buy those that comic book. And he also talked about how she would do portraits of characters from the comic books, and she mentioned Superboy and Doll Man, and also some of the lesser known characters like I think the Black Terror was one that he mentioned, and how they were always drawing. And in fact, he said him and all of his siblings were always drawing when they were younger, although only 2 of them only he and Gilbert have stuck with it over the years. Wendy asked him about writing and drawing Maggie and Hopi and why he's so good at it. And he basically, once again, he was very effusive, and he said that he was a good guesser. He said he knows about the punk scene, he said, and he knows about being Mexican American, but he's not a woman, and so he can only guess at some of the things. But he said every time the first time he got a compliment from a woman on the way he wrote them, the way he drew them, Maggie and Hopi, he took it as a big compliment. He felt, yes, I'm doing something right. There was a number of other things that came up. Like there was a couple times during this panel, there was a question about how working with Fantagraphics changed things as far as the formatting of the books, because originally they had been self-publishing. And he said it was basically just a business thing that didn't really have any impact on the way he tells stories. They're not telling him what kind of stories to tell. It's just the format, I guess, how big the books are, how many stories they'll package together, how many pages a book needs to be, that kind of stuff. And like I said, it came up earlier in the panel, and then somebody asked, I think Wendy asked it earlier in the panel, and then somebody asked a very similar question later on in the panel. Kickstarter was discussed. Somebody asked about animation, whether he had ever tried to get it made into a cartoon, and he said that he had talks with Hollywood people, but they'd never gone anywhere, that he had always gotten the impression that they weren't interested in making the same thing that he was. I believe that's what he said. Wendy asked him about if there was any mainstream comic books, any superhero characters that he was interested in drawing, and he kind of waffled on that. He was kind of like, well, not really, but he said, but yeah, if there's any, it would be Wonder Woman. And then he talked about how he had kind of written Wonder Woman into a Love and Rocket story, but he didn't realize it, he said, until just then, that he had created a character that looked kind of like Wonder Woman, but the uniform was different. And so maybe someday I'll read that story. I don't know. But and then he got a question about the Love and Rockets name, where the name came from, and how he felt about the band Love and Rockets taking the name, because the band came about after the comic book did. And he said they weren't too pleased about it. They really didn't like that, but that they really didn't want to go to court to deal with this. They didn't have a lot of money to do that, and so they weren't going to do anything about it, but they did feel kind of, it did irk them that they took the name of their comic book and used it as the name of their band, this British band. And he talked about another band which had taken a name of one of the characters in the comic book, and not Maggie or Hopi, but I think it was Speedy Ortiz, and how that didn't bother him as much. And I think that was about the end of the Jaime Hernandez panel. I tried to go by his table later on, but when I did go by, he was already talking to somebody else, so I didn't get a chance to talk to him. After the panel, I spent a couple more hours at the show. I went down to, I believe it's the same retailer that I bought some trades from last year, and I went through their long boxes, and I found a few comic books. They were $3 a piece, or 4 for $10. So I managed to pick out 4 comic books, all kind of retro comic books in a way. I mean, none of them were new. They were all from the 80s. But retro even in their subject matter at the time that the comics came out. I bought 2 issues of Sergeant Rock. One is issue 405, which is a first part of a 2-parter, and the other one is issue 417, which I think is also the first part of a 2-parter. Both have beautiful covers by Joe Kubert, and Andy Kubert did the art on the second one, on the interiors, but not the first one. I think the first one was done by, I want to say, Adrian Gonzalez. I'm not certain, although I might be getting that mixed up with. Then I bought an issue of Unknown Soldier. I found the last issue of Unknown Soldier. If you know anything about collecting the last issues of comic book runs, quite often it's difficult to find the last issue. And I actually checked to make sure it was the last issue, because it said the final adventure of the Unknown Soldier. And I wanted to make sure that it was actually the final story of the Unknown Soldier. So I actually looked it up on Comic Book DB, and it was. And actually it's kind of interesting, because both of these, this one and I think issue 417 of Sergeant Rock, have mentions of the death of Adolf Hitler. And on this Unknown Soldier cover, it says, was it suicide or justice? And you can see the shadow of it, or the like a ghostly image of the Unknown Soldier. And then behind that, you can see Hitler's body dead, and I guess it's supposed to be Eva Braun with him. And then the 4th book I got was actually a trade, although it was mixed in with the comic books, and so I didn't have to pay the trade prices for it. I mean, it's kind of beat up, but it's The Shadow, Blood and Judgment by Howard Chaykin. And I read it, the last thing I read by Howard Chaykin was the Black Hawk miniseries, and so this was a mini-series originally, and then it was collected in a trade format, and it includes a couple. There's an introduction by Anthony Tolan, and then there's a interview with Howard Chaykin, which is done by Joe Orlando. I haven't read any of this yet, but I'm curious to get into this and to read it. The Shadow's a character that I really liked. And I talked, I think, a little bit about the Shadow way back on an episode in the 20s. Well, I talked about him briefly, because I talked about the Shadow radio show and how that was something that I listened to, and how we had a cassette of the Shadow. So those were the comic books I bought. Let's see. I talked to Andy Jewett. I talked to the O'Briens again. I got one more commission from, this one was from Jim Terry. Jim Terry last year did a commission of the Vulture for me, the Spider-Man villain, the Vulture, which I really liked. And so I asked him if he was doing commissions, because while I was standing there talking to him, he took down his sign that said he was still doing commissions, and he said, well, he wasn't feeling too well, and he had a really rough week, and so he wasn't sure if he was. And then we started talking, and then he was like, well, okay, I can get you something by tomorrow. And so I asked him for a commission of Loki, because as I think I mentioned before, I just recently saw the second Thor film, and so he said sure, he could do that, and I said I wanted it Loki from the movie or the movies, and and I mentioned the helmet with the big horns, and so he said he'd have it by tomorrow definitely, but he finished it today, and he did a beautiful job with it, It's just the character of Loki. There's nothing in the background, but it's beautifully done. I mean, some of it is much more finer lines than I think what he did in the Condor piece that he did for me last year. But all the same, I mean, like I said, I really love it. Let me see. Let me flip back to that Condor piece if I can find it. Or maybe I don't have it in this book. Thought I did. I guess not. But I've got to say, I think I like this a little better than they're both great pieces. They're both great pieces of artwork. But I will be posting that, of course. The only other thing I think I should mention is I talked to Christopher Mitten. He did a commission for me last year of The Bride of Frankenstein, which makes, I believe, 3 pieces I have of The Bride of Frankenstein. And I was thinking about asking him to do a commission for me, but he had a huge stack of artwork, of original artwork, for sale, and they were just $25 a page. And so I just went through all of them. He was working on a commission for somebody else, so I let him work for the most part. I asked him twice I asked him a question, but for the most part, he worked on that. And like I said, it was a really big stack of artwork. I mean, there was probably 100 or more pages, and I kind of slowly worked my way through it. And I finally found a page there was a number of pages that I liked, I should say. But I finally found a page towards the bottom that I really liked, and it's from a comic book called Umbral, which I have not read, but he had both trades of it available. And I'm probably going to buy the first trade from him. I might buy the first 2. I'm not sure, because I think it's basically one story. Although he said that they do have plans. He and the writer, whose name I cannot remember, do have plans to do more of this story. But he said they had gotten to a stopping point. So it's a little open-ended. But I really liked the page, and what really turned me on about the page was that on the back side he had done the pencils, and then he had turned it over and redone the whole thing, apparently. Although just from the look, just from looking at it, I didn't really notice how different it was from the back to the front. It looked more or less the same, but I think there must have been something a little different, because he said something about, when I asked him about that, he said something about starting over, how he flipped it over and started over. But it's beautiful artwork, and I don't know a lot about this. I don't know the story. I started to read the description on the back, but I think I really need to read the story to understand it. But the page is from the last chapter in the first volume. And I didn't bring my binder for the 11 by 14 art pages with me, and so I asked him if he could hold on to it for me until tomorrow, and he said he could. So tomorrow I'm going to go back. I will get that. I'm almost certain I will pick up that first trade of Umbral, and tomorrow. So that's about it for day one of Appleseed Comic Con. I think I've been talking for quite a while now. I'm not sure if it all made sense or if it all is worth listening to. I shouldn't say that. I had a lot of fun at the show. I think it's a great show. It's kind of crazy. It still feels kind of crazy that I drove all the way, that I drove 12 hours to get here, to hang out for a day and a half and then turn around and drive right back. But that's exactly what I'm doing. It's what I did last year, and it's what I'm doing this year. So basically tomorrow morning I'm going to get up, I'm going to take a shower, have breakfast, pack my stuff, and then head on over to the convention center and hang out there until and hang out there for a couple hours at the show, and then I'm going to take off and head home. I have plans to stop at another. Well, let me get into that tomorrow. I'm probably going to record something in the car before I leave Fort Wayne. I did stick with my plan to eat the dinners that I brought both last night and tonight. I went to Kroger this morning and picked up some stuff. I bought some bottled water just because I'm not sure about the water here in Fort Wayne. The tap water, that is, of course. I bought some more pita bread because I was a little short on pita bread. I really only needed one piece of pita bread, but I just bought a whole bag because I know I'll take it home with me and I'll eat it at home. And I bought some snacky type food, some trail mix type stuff at the Kroger. So I didn't go out for lunch. I just ate trail mix for lunch, and I was really famished by the time I got back to the hotel this evening, an hour or two ago. So I spent about $70, $80 at the show today. Let's see, 10, 20, 50, 65, 70, $76. And I'm thinking I'm going to spend another 40 or 50 tomorrow at the show, I think. And then I'll be heading home. Yeah, something like that. They did have a get-together tonight at a bar. In fact, it's probably still going on right now. I think it started around 8 o'clock. It's now about 9:30. I don't think I'm going to head over there. I think I'm going to get some rest, chill, and maybe read some comic books. That's right. There was a book that I'll have to talk about that at another point. There was a book. I talked to a writer whose name. Wait a minute. I can find his name in the program guide. That I can do. Let's see. His name was George Kramer, and he's written a series of books. He had them all there, but he said they were also available electronically. And it sounds like kind of a fantasy type story having to do with magic and a world where there's people of different colored magics, and they're supposed to marry only people of the same color magic, but then somebody from the yellow magic marries somebody from the blue magic, and they have a child who's then green magic, and it sounds kind of interesting. So I'm at least going to check it out online. Probably read they usually have a preview available for those Kindle books. You can read, like the first 10 pages or chapter or whatever it amounts to. I think that's about it from Appleseed for day one. Like I said, I had a lot of fun. I could see myself doing this again. It doesn't mean I will next year. I'm not sure. I should probably wait until I get home in about another. Well, it'll probably be the middle of the night sometime, 1 or 2 in the morning on Monday morning, or maybe even give it another 24 to 48 hours before I decide. I guess I don't have to make any decisions right away. I think right now I'm going to take some pictures of the stuff that I bought and put those up, maybe tweet those out or put them up online. And so that's it for day one of the 2015 Appleseed Comic Con. Yes, Comic Con. That's it for episode 73 of Dave Talks Comics. Dave Talks Comics can be found on the web at davetalkscomics.com and on Facebook at facebook.com/DaveTalksComics. On Twitter at DaveTalksComics. Email can be sent to davetalkscomics@gmail.com. Next time on Dave Talks Comics, I will be wrapping up my coverage of Appleseed Comic Con and also providing more notes from the road on my drive back from the show. In the meantime, I will be posting my recording of the Jaime Hernandez panel between now and that next episode, although that I'm not going to release it technically as an episode of Dave Talks Comics. It'll be in the feed, but I don't consider it to be an episode. And also the other panel that I went to, the Jack Kirby and the Anti-Life Equation panel, which by Kyle Latino, has been posted on YouTube, and so I will be providing a link to that, and so that you can see it, not only hear what he had to say, and I did record it, but he in his YouTube video you can see all of the visuals that he provided, and as well as getting the audio of his talk that he gave on Jack Kirby, recurring themes in Jack Kirby's comic book stories. I'm Dave. Thank you for listening.